Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. The morning sun filtered gently through the lace curtains, casting intricate patterns on the wooden floor of the living room. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen and the smell of freshly cut grass wafting in from outside created a serene backdrop. Yet among the ordered chaos of breakfast dishes and the soft ticking of a wall clock, an unsettling sight caught the eye: a solitary chair, not aligned with the others, facing a corner. The air felt heavy, as if a silent presence lingered nearby, watching, waiting for something to happen. I know why that chair is there. I moved it myself 3 days ago when everything changed. The explanation is simple, logical even, though I understand why it might look strange to an outsider. My sister had been staying with me for 2 weeks, helping me sort through our mother's belongings after the funeral. She always preferred sitting in corners when she was upset, claiming it helped her think. That morning, she'd pulled the chair over while I was making coffee, positioning it just so she could stare at the intersection of those 2 walls where our mother used to hang her collection of small mirrors. The mirrors were gone now, packed away in boxes destined for storage. My sister had insisted on wrapping each one individually in newspaper, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. She'd always been the sentimental one, the keeper of family memories and traditions. When she finished with the mirrors, she'd sat in that chair for nearly an hour, not speaking, just staring at the blank wall where they'd hung for 23 years. I remember walking past her several times, carrying boxes to the garage, and each time she seemed smaller somehow, diminished by grief in a way that made my chest tighten. The morning light caught the dust motes dancing around her, and I thought about taking a photograph, capturing this moment of quiet sorrow, but something held me back. Instead, I let her sit there undisturbed while I continued packing. But there's something about the quality of light in that memory that doesn't sit right. The way it fell across her shoulders seemed wrong somehow, too golden for the time of day I remember it being. And when I tried to recall the sound of her breathing, that soft rhythm that should have been audible in the morning stillness, I hear nothing. Just the refrigerator's hum and the distant sound of a lawnmower outside. The chair faces the corner at an angle that would make it uncomfortable to sit in for long periods. I know this because I've tried it myself since she left. The wooden seat digs into your legs after about 10 minutes, and the position strains your neck if you're actually trying to look at the wall. Yet in my memory, she sat there for an hour, perfectly still, perfectly comfortable. There's a scuff mark on the floor where the chair legs scraped against the wood. I noticed it yesterday while vacuuming, a series of thin scratches that suggest the chair was moved multiple times, not just once. The marks form an arc, as if someone had been adjusting the position repeatedly, searching for the right angle, the perfect view of something I couldn't see. I called my sister that evening to ask about the chair, about why she'd chosen that particular spot. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail, and her recorded voice sounded different than I remembered, flatter somehow, as if she were reading from a script. I left a message asking her to call me back, but she never did. When I tried again the next day, the number was disconnected. The smell of freshly cut grass grows stronger as I stand here now, even though I can see through the window that my neighbor's lawn hasn't been mowed in over a week. The grass is getting long, bending under its own weight, creating patterns that shift with the breeze. But the smell persists, sweet and sharp, mixing with something else I can't identify. Something metallic, like coins left too long in a pocket. I've started having dreams about that morning, but in the dreams, the chair is empty. I walk through the house carrying boxes, and each time I pass the living room, the chair sits there facing the corner, waiting. In the dreams, I know someone should be sitting there, but I can't remember who. The absence feels heavier than any presence could. Sometimes I wake up with the taste of newspaper ink on my tongue, though I haven't read a physical paper in years. My hands smell like old glass, the way antique mirrors do when you handle them without gloves. I've started keeping the windows closed, but the scent of cut grass finds its way in anyway, growing stronger each day. The breakfast dishes I mentioned are still there, though I live alone and rarely eat breakfast at the table. 2 plates, 2 coffee cups, one with lipstick marks around the rim. The lipstick is a shade I don't own, a deep red that looks almost brown in certain light. When I touch the rim of the cup, it's still warm, though the coffee inside has long since gone cold. I've been avoiding the living room lately, but the chair draws me back. Each time I look at it, I notice something new. Today, there's an indentation in the seat cushion, as if someone has been sitting there recently. The fabric holds the impression of a body, the outline of someone smaller than me, more delicate. When I press my hand against the cushion, it's warm. The wall clock has stopped ticking. I only noticed this morning when the silence became unbearable. The hands point to 10:15, though I can't remember if that's morning or evening. Time feels fluid in this house now, stretching and contracting like a living thing. I've replaced the battery twice, but the clock refuses to move forward. In my clearest moments, I know my sister was never here. I packed our mother's belongings alone, working in silence, moving methodically from room to room. The mirrors went into boxes, wrapped in newspaper I'd saved for months, and I carried them to storage by myself. The chair was always in that corner, has been there since childhood, though I'd forgotten until now. But then I smell that metallic scent again, feel the warmth radiating from the empty cushion, and I'm not sure of anything anymore. The house holds its secrets close, and I'm beginning to understand that some truths are too large to fit inside our small certainties. The chair waits in its corner, patient and knowing, while I circle around the edges of a memory that might not be mine at all. The morning light continues to filter through the lace curtains, casting the same intricate patterns it always has. But now I see them differently, these shadows and shapes dancing across the wooden floor. They look less like decoration and more like writing, a message spelled out in light and darkness that I'm only just learning to read. Story 2. The study door creaked open upon initial entry. Books remained orderly on the shelves, no spines out of place. A single chair was positioned at the center, facing a blank wall. The clock ticked predictably, maintaining time without deviation. A cold cup of coffee sat undisturbed next to an untouched notepad. Curtains were drawn, containing the dimness, although one side was inexplicably shorter than the other. All surfaces were dust-free, including those seldom used. But beneath the chair, the rug was still warm. I knew then what I had suspected for weeks. Someone had been here. The warmth under my fingertips felt like proof, though proof of what exactly remained unclear. I pressed my palm against the fibers, feeling residual heat that shouldn't have existed in an empty house. The sensation traveled up my arm, settling somewhere between my shoulder blades like a weight I couldn't shake. When did the suspicion begin? Perhaps it was the morning I noticed the coffee cup had moved 3 inches to the left on the desk. Such a small thing, barely perceptible, yet it lodged itself in my consciousness like a splinter. I remember standing in the doorway, staring at that cup, trying to recall if I had placed it there myself. Memory became unreliable then, folding in on itself. The notepad held impressions from previous writing, though the top sheet remained blank. Running a pencil lightly across the surface revealed fragments of words, partial sentences that made no complete sense. The chair nose appeared in faint graphite, followed by what looked like watching from before the impression faded into illegibility. I traced these phantom words repeatedly, each time convincing myself I could discern new meanings from the indentations. My fingers grew gray with pencil dust. There were other signs, or what I believed to be signs. The curtain that hung shorter on the left side had been perfectly even when I first arranged this room. I was certain of this, though certainty felt increasingly fragile. Had someone adjusted it deliberately, or had the fabric simply settled unevenly over time? The asymmetry drew my eye every time I entered the space, creating an imbalance that seemed intentional. I began spending more time in the study, sitting in that chair, facing the blank wall. The position felt significant somehow, as if whoever had been here before understood something about this particular vantage point that I did not. The wall revealed nothing obvious, just pale paint and the faint outline of a rectangle where a picture frame had once hung. Yet I found myself staring at that empty space for extended periods, waiting for revelation. The books on the shelves maintained their orderly appearance, spines aligned with mathematical precision. Too precise, perhaps. I started checking their positions obsessively, measuring distances with my fingers, memorizing the exact placement of each volume. A treatise on maritime law sat next to a collection of botanical illustrations. Below that, a memoir by someone whose name I recognized but couldn't place. The arrangement felt deliberately random, as if designed to appear natural while concealing some deeper organization. One afternoon, I discovered a bookmark protruding from the maritime law text. The page it marked contained a passage about salvage rights, specifically regarding vessels found abandoned at sea. Someone had underlined certain phrases in pencil: presumption of abandonment and rightful possession. The graphite looked fresh, though I couldn't remember making these marks myself. But memory had become unreliable. I began reconstructing the timeline of my suspicions, searching for the moment when normal became strange. The coffee cup incident seemed like the beginning, but perhaps there had been earlier signs I missed. The way dust settled on some surfaces but not others. The faint scent of tobacco that lingered despite no one smoking in this house for months. Small disruptions in routine that accumulated like sediment. The chair became my anchor point, the place from which I observed and cataloged these anomalies. Its leather seat had molded to accommodate a specific body shape, though whether mine or someone else's remained unclear. I adjusted my posture repeatedly, trying to find the position that felt most natural, most intended. Sometimes I imagined I could sense the impression of another person, their weight still somehow present in the cushioning. The blank wall opposite the chair held my attention for hours. Its emptiness felt pregnant with possibility, as if something should be there but had been deliberately removed. I studied every imperfection in the paint, every slight variation in texture, searching for clues about what might have occupied that space. The rectangular outline suggested a substantial frame, something significant enough to leave a permanent shadow. Gradually, I began to suspect that the arrangement of this room was not random, but carefully orchestrated. The chair positioned at the optimal distance from the wall, the desk placed to catch light from the window despite the drawn curtains, the books organized according to some system I couldn't decipher. Every element seemed to serve a purpose I was only beginning to understand. The notepad yielded new impressions each time I examined it. Pressing harder with the pencil revealed deeper indentations, fragments of text that seemed to reference maritime activities. Harbor at low tide appeared beneath my careful rubbing, followed by what looked like coordinates or measurements. The handwriting was unfamiliar, though something about the letter formations seemed almost recognizable. I started keeping my own notes, documenting each discovery, each shift in the room's atmosphere. The act of writing felt important, as if I was participating in some ongoing dialogue with the previous occupant. My observations filled page after page. The way morning light struck the shorter curtain differently, the sound the chair made when weight shifted in its seat, the temperature variations I detected in different areas of the rug. But reviewing these notes later, I sometimes found discrepancies between what I had written and what I remembered observing. Words appeared that I didn't recall writing, descriptions that seemed too detailed to be accurate. The boundary between observation and imagination began to blur. The maritime law book drew me back repeatedly. Its pages contained numerous underlined passages, marginal notes, and inserted slips of paper covered with calculations. Someone had been studying salvage law intently, focusing particularly on cases involving disputed ownership of recovered vessels. The annotations suggested familiarity with actual legal proceedings, as if the reader had personal experience with such matters. One inserted paper contained a hand-drawn map of what appeared to be a harbor or inlet. Depth measurements were marked at various points, along with notations about tidal patterns and seasonal variations. The map was oriented to show the view from land looking seaward, with several X marks indicating positions of interest. The paper felt old, its edges soft with handling. I began to construct a narrative around these clues, imagining the person who had occupied this chair before me, someone with maritime knowledge and legal concerns, someone who studied tidal charts and calculated salvage rights, someone who had reason to monitor harbor activities and document their findings in careful detail. But was this person real, or was I creating them from fragments and impressions? The question haunted my observations. Each new discovery could be interpreted multiple ways. The underlined passages might have been made by a previous owner of the book, someone unconnected to the current mystery. The map could be a relic from an old vacation, meaningless doodles rather than serious documentation. The warm rug might simply retain heat from afternoon sunlight filtering through the curtains. Yet the accumulation of details felt too coherent to be coincidental. The maritime theme running through the books, the legal focus of the annotations, the careful positioning of furniture to create an observation post these elements suggested purpose and planning. Someone had used this room as a base of operations for activities I could only guess at. I found myself adopting their perspective, sitting in the chair for extended periods, studying the blank wall as if it might reveal secrets. The room's atmosphere seemed to encourage this kind of patient watching, this quiet attention to detail. Hours passed unnoticed as I absorbed the subtle rhythms of the space, the way shadows shifted across surfaces, the gradual cooling of air as day progressed toward evening. The coffee cup became a focal point of my obsession. Its position on the desk varied slightly each time I checked, moving in increments so small they might have been imaginary. I began marking its location with tiny pencil dots, creating a constellation of points that tracked its migration across the desktop. The pattern that emerged suggested deliberate movement rather than random displacement. But who was moving it? The question circled back on itself endlessly. If someone else was entering this room, they left no other obvious traces. No footprints in the dust, no disturbance of the carefully arranged books, no foreign objects introduced to the space. Only these minute adjustments that could easily be explained by my own forgetfulness, my own unconscious actions performed and forgotten. Yet the certainty persisted that I was not alone in this investigation. The notepad continued to yield impressions, layers of previous writing that built up a palimpsest of intentions and observations. Beneath the maritime references, I discovered what appeared to be personal notes, fragments of thoughts and concerns that felt more intimate than the legal research. They suspect something appeared in one rubbing, followed by must be more careful about timing in another. These personal revelations changed my understanding of the previous occupant, not just someone interested in maritime law, but someone engaged in activities that required secrecy and caution. Someone who felt watched, pursued, or threatened. Someone who had reason to document their activities while concealing their true purpose. The parallel to my own situation was unsettling. I too was documenting observations while uncertain of their significance. I too felt the need for caution, though I couldn't articulate what I was being cautious about. The room seemed to impose its own logic, its own requirements for secrecy and careful attention to detail. Perhaps everyone who occupied this chair eventually adopted the same patterns of behavior. The books on the shelves began to feel like a curated collection, each volume chosen for its relevance to some overarching project. Maritime law, botanical illustrations, personal memoirs, historical accounts of coastal communities, the subject seemed unrelated until viewed from the perspective of someone conducting research into specific activities or events. Someone trying to understand the intersection of legal precedent, natural cycles, and human behavior. I started reading these books systematically, following the trail of underlined passages and marginal notes. A pattern emerged of interests focused on the liminal spaces where land meets water, where legal jurisdiction becomes ambiguous, where ownership and possession blur into complex negotiations. The previous occupant had been mapping these ambiguities, cataloging the gaps in official oversight. But to what end? The hand-drawn map provided the most concrete clue. Its detailed soundings and tidal notations suggested intimate knowledge of a specific harbor or inlet. The X marks indicated positions of particular interest, though whether they marked hazards, opportunities, or simple reference points remained unclear. The map's orientation suggested it was meant to be used from this very room, as if the window provided a view of the charted waters. Yet the curtains remained drawn, blocking any view of the outside world. I began to suspect that the curtain's asymmetry was intentional, creating a narrow gap that allowed limited observation while maintaining concealment. Standing at the window and peering through this gap, I could see water in the distance, a harbor that matched the general configuration shown on the hand-drawn map. The perspective aligned perfectly with the chart's orientation. Someone had been watching that harbor from this room. The realization shifted my understanding of everything I had observed. The chair positioned for optimal viewing angles, the books chosen to provide background knowledge for interpreting harbor activities, the notepad ready to record observations. This wasn't just a study, but a surveillance post, carefully designed for monitoring maritime activities while remaining undetected. But surveillance of what exactly? The maritime law text suggested interest in salvage operations, vessels found abandoned or in distress. The personal notes hinted at concerns about being discovered, about timing and caution. The map marked specific positions that could be landing sites, mooring points, or locations where valuable cargo might be recovered. The pieces suggested involvement in activities that existed in legal gray areas, possibly profitable but certainly requiring discretion. I found myself drawn into the same patterns of observation, spending hours at the window gap, studying the distant harbor through the narrow opening. The view was limited but strategic, offering sight lines to the main channel while remaining invisible to casual observers. Boats moved through the harbor at predictable intervals, following routes I began to memorize and anticipate. The coffee cup's movements took on new significance when viewed as part of this surveillance operation. Its changing positions might mark the timing of observed activities, a simple coding system for recording when specific events occurred. The cup's location corresponding to different zones of the harbor, its distance from the desk's edge indicating duration or intensity of activity. But was I interpreting these movements correctly or creating patterns from randomness? The question became central to my growing obsession. Every observation could be explained multiple ways. Every piece of evidence supported various interpretations. The room encouraged this kind of analytical thinking, this careful weighing of possibilities and probabilities. Yet it also seemed to resist definitive conclusions, maintaining ambiguity even as details accumulated. I began leaving my own marks in the notepad, adding observations to the palimpsest of previous investigations. My handwriting mixed with the impressions of earlier text, creating a dialogue across time between different occupants of this chair. We were all asking similar questions, noting similar patterns, struggling with the same fundamental uncertainty about what we were actually observing. The books became conversation partners, their underlined passages responding to my questions and concerns. The maritime law texts provided framework for understanding the legal implications of various activities. The botanical illustrations showed seasonal changes that might affect timing and visibility. The personal memoirs offered insights into the psychology of people who operated in ambiguous circumstances. Yet the blank wall continued to dominate my attention, its emptiness more compelling than any of the written materials. Whatever had hung there must have been significant, important enough to leave a permanent impression in the paint. The rectangular outline measured approximately 2 feet by 3 feet, the size of a substantial photograph or detailed chart. Perhaps it had been a larger version of the hand-drawn map, showing the harbor in greater detail with more comprehensive annotations, or a photograph of specific vessels, individuals, or activities that required careful study and identification. Something too sensitive to leave displayed, removed when the surveillance operation ended or when the risk of discovery became too great. The removal suggested urgency, a sudden need to eliminate evidence while leaving other materials in place. Why take the wall-mounted item but leave the books with their revealing annotations? Why remove the display but abandon the hand-drawn map? The selective elimination implied different levels of sensitivity, some information being more dangerous than others. I started photographing everything with my phone, creating a digital record of the room's contents and their positions. The images revealed details I had missed during direct observation, subtle variations in dust patterns, slight discolorations that might indicate previous arrangements of furniture or equipment. The camera's perspective differed from my seated viewpoint, showing angles and relationships that weren't apparent from the chair. But reviewing these photographs later, I sometimes noticed elements that seemed to have changed between shots. Not dramatic alterations, but small shifts in positioning that suggested ongoing activity in the room. The coffee cup appeared in slightly different locations across multiple images taken on the same day. Books that seemed perfectly aligned in one photograph showed minor adjustments in the next. Was someone else accessing this room between my visits? The possibility both thrilled and unsettled me. If another person was continuing the surveillance operation, it meant the activities being monitored were still ongoing, still significant enough to require observation. But it also meant I might be interfering with or compromising their work, potentially putting both of us at risk. I began varying my schedule, arriving at different times to see if I could detect patterns in the room's usage. Some days the chair felt recently occupied, its leather still warm and molded to accommodate weight. Other days the atmosphere seemed undisturbed, dust settling evenly across surfaces. The variations suggested irregular but continuing use by someone other than myself. The notepad impressions grew more complex as multiple hands contributed to the palimpsest. My careful rubbings revealed layers of text in different writing styles, some using pencil, others pen, a few employing what appeared to be charcoal or soft graphite. The most recent impressions showed increasing urgency, with phrases like activity increasing and need to relocate soon appearing in bold strokes. The sense of imminent change permeated my observations. Whatever operation this room supported was approaching some kind of conclusion or crisis point. The careful documentation of harbor activities, the legal research into salvage rights, the strategic positioning for surveillance, all of it building toward an event that might already be in motion. I found myself checking the harbor view more frequently, studying the boats and their movements with increased attention to detail. Patterns that had seemed routine began to reveal anomalies, vessels that didn't follow expected routes, activities that occurred at unusual times. The hand-drawn map helped me identify specific locations where these irregularities clustered, areas marked with X's that now seemed to predict rather than simply record. The coffee cup's position became a daily indicator of activity levels and concerns. When placed near the window, it seemed to signal high alert status. When positioned at the desk center, it suggested routine monitoring. When moved to the far edge, it might indicate temporary suspension of observations. The coding system was subtle but consistent, a form of communication between the room's various occupants. But communication about what exactly? The maritime law books provided context for understanding the legal framework surrounding the observed activities. Salvage operations existed in complex regulatory environments, with rights and responsibilities that shifted based on circumstances, jurisdiction, and timing. Vessels found in international waters fell under different rules than those recovered in territorial seas. Abandoned cargo could be claimed by salvagers, but determining true abandonment required careful documentation and proper legal procedures. Someone was using this knowledge to evaluate opportunities in the harbor, identifying situations where valuable recovery might be possible while remaining within legal boundaries. The surveillance operation was gathering intelligence about vessel movements, cargo manifests, and potential abandonment scenarios. The information was being used to position salvage operations for maximum profit while minimizing legal risk. Yet questions remained about the legitimacy of these activities. The secrecy suggested operations that, while possibly legal, existed in gray areas that might not withstand close scrutiny. The concern about timing and discovery implied activities that required careful coordination with official oversight or deliberate avoidance of such oversight. I began to see myself as an accidental participant in this operation, my observations contributing to the ongoing intelligence gathering whether I intended it or not. My photographs documented current harbor conditions. My notes tracked vessel movements and activity patterns. My presence in the room maintained the surveillance post's operational status. But was I helping or hindering the operation's success? The question became more pressing as signs of imminent action accumulated. The notepad impressions showed increasing frequency of observations, with daily entries replacing the previous pattern of sporadic documentation. The coffee cup moved more often, sometimes shifting position multiple times within a single day. The books showed evidence of intensive recent consultation, with new marginal notes appearing in fresh pencil. Something significant was approaching, and the room's occupants were preparing for it. I started spending entire days in the study, maintaining continuous observation of the harbor while documenting everything I witnessed. Boats arrived and departed according to schedules I gradually learned to predict. Cargo was loaded and unloaded following patterns that revealed the harbor's commercial rhythms. Yet within this routine activity, anomalies persisted that suggested opportunities for the kind of salvage operations described in the legal texts. A fishing vessel that moored in unusual locations, a cargo ship that seemed to discharge more material than it loaded, small boats that moved between larger vessels without obvious purpose. These irregularities created the conditions where salvage rights might be exercised, where abandoned or distressed cargo might become available for legitimate recovery. The hand-drawn map marked several of these activity zones with X's, indicating positions where such opportunities were most likely to arise. The depth soundings showed which areas could accommodate different types of vessels. The tidal notations indicated optimal timing for various operations. The map was a comprehensive guide to conducting salvage activities in this particular harbor. But it was also evidence of premeditation, documentation that could be used to prove deliberate planning rather than opportunistic response to discovered abandonment. The careful preparation suggested activities that went beyond simple salvage into more complex territory involving coordination, timing, and possibly collusion with vessel operators. I realized I was documenting my own involvement in these activities, creating a record that could be used as evidence of participation or conspiracy. My photographs, notes, and observations were building a case that could implicate me in whatever operation this room supported. Yet I felt compelled to continue, drawn deeper into the surveillance by curiosity and fascination with the unfolding mystery. The blank walls seemed to watch my growing involvement, its emptiness a reminder of what had been removed when the previous operation concluded. Whatever evidence had been displayed there was gone, eliminated when the risk of discovery became too great. Would my own contributions eventually require similar elimination? The thought should have been disturbing, but instead it felt like validation. I was becoming a genuine participant in something significant, something that required the same level of caution and secrecy that had characterized the previous occupants' work. The room was accepting me as a legitimate successor to its surveillance function. Days passed in careful observation and documentation. The harbor's rhythms became as familiar as my own heartbeat. I could predict vessel arrivals, anticipate cargo movements, identify the subtle variations that indicated opportunities for salvage operations. The knowledge felt valuable, significant, worth the growing risks of discovery. Then one morning I entered the study to find the chair moved slightly off its optimal position. The coffee cup sat in a location I had never seen before, balanced precariously on the desk's very edge. The notepad showed fresh impressions that, when rubbed with pencil, revealed a single word: soon. The operation was entering its final phase. I repositioned the chair carefully, aligning it for optimal observation of the harbor. The view through the curtain gap showed increased activity, more vessels than usual moving through the main channel. Several boats were moored in positions marked on the hand-drawn map, their presence confirming the chart's accuracy and relevance. The coffee cup's precarious position suggested maximum alert status, a warning that critical events were imminent. I maintained continuous watch through the afternoon, documenting every movement, every variation from normal patterns. As evening approached, the activity intensified rather than diminishing as usual. 3 small boats converged on a position marked with an X on the map. A larger vessel appeared to be in distress, listing slightly and moving erratically through the channel. The scenario matched descriptions from the maritime law texts of situations where salvage rights could be exercised legitimately. But legitimacy depended on proper procedures being followed, on documentation that proved abandonment rather than coordination. The careful preparation evident in this room suggested activities that might not meet those standards, operations that relied on created rather than discovered opportunities. I photographed everything, my camera capturing the unfolding events that the room's previous occupants had spent so much time preparing for. The images would provide evidence of what actually occurred versus what might be officially reported. They would document the truth behind whatever salvage claims emerged from this evening's activities. Yet I also realized I was creating evidence that could implicate everyone involved, including myself. The photographs proved premeditation, planning, and coordination. They showed that what appeared to be spontaneous salvage was actually carefully orchestrated activity. As darkness fell, the harbor activity concluded. The boats dispersed, the distressed vessel was taken in tow, and normal evening quiet returned to the water. Whatever operation this room had supported was complete, its objectives apparently achieved. I gathered my materials and prepared to leave, uncertain whether I would return to continue the surveillance. The room's purpose had been fulfilled, its careful preparation vindicated by successful execution of the planned operation. Perhaps it would now return to being simply a study, its books and furniture resuming normal domestic functions. But as I reached the door, I noticed the rug beneath the chair was still warm, retaining heat from extended occupation. Someone else had been here recently, possibly while I was focused on the harbor activities. The surveillance post remained active, its function continuing despite the completion of the evening's operation. I understood then that what I had witnessed was not an ending but a beginning, not the conclusion of the room's surveillance function, but its validation and continuation. The successful operation proved the value of the observation post, justified its careful preparation and strategic positioning. Other opportunities would arise, other vessels would require monitoring, other salvage operations would need coordination. The room would continue its patient watching, its careful documentation, its quiet contribution to activities that existed in the gray areas between legal and questionable. And I would be part of it, another occupant of the chair, another contributor to the palimpsest of observations and intentions. The room had accepted me, incorporated me into its ongoing function, made me complicit in its purposes. The study door creaked open upon my final entry. Books remained orderly on the shelves, no spines out of place. A single chair was positioned at the center, facing a blank wall. The clock ticked predictably, maintaining time without deviation. A cold cup of coffee sat undisturbed next to an untouched notepad. Curtains were drawn, containing the dimness, although one side was inexplicably shorter than the other. All surfaces were dust-free, including those seldom used. But beneath the chair, the rug was still warm. Story 3. It wasn't the first time the hallway seemed unusually quiet. A light flickered above, the bulb barely managing to illuminate the chipped paint and worn carpet. Papers sat on the desk in neat piles, shifted slightly from where they were left, but then again, maybe it was just a breeze from an open window. I counted the files, missing one, yet they all looked so alike it was easy to misplace one and not notice. The clock ticked steadily, marking the minutes but offering no comfort. When I locked the door behind me, I left a key hidden, just in case. The coffee was still warm when I returned. That should have meant something, but I couldn't decide what. Steam rose from the cup in lazy spirals, and I wondered if I had made it myself or if someone else had been there. The taste was bitter, more bitter than I remembered making it. I always added cream. She had been asking questions about the missing file, not directly, never directly. The way she tilted her head when she spoke, the pause before she answered my questions about her schedule. Her fingers drummed against the desk when she thought I wasn't looking, a nervous habit or something else entirely. The parking lot was empty except for 2 cars, mine and one I didn't recognize. Dark sedan, license plate obscured by mud. It had been there for 3 days now, or maybe longer. Time had a way of folding in on itself lately, making everything feel both immediate and distant. I found the key exactly where I had left it, under the loose brick by the back entrance, wrapped in tissue paper that had grown damp from the morning dew. But the tissue looked different, cleaner somehow, as if someone had replaced it with a fresh piece. My hands shook as I unwrapped it, though I told myself it was just the cold. The file contained photographs, black and white images of a place I recognized but couldn't name. A room with tall windows and shadows that fell at impossible angles. In one photo, a figure stood near the window, face turned away from the camera. The posture was familiar, the way the shoulders curved inward, defensive. She called in sick that day. Her voice on the phone sounded strained, different. When I asked if she needed anything, she said no, but the silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken words. I offered to bring her soup, medication, anything. She hung up before I could finish the sentence. The photographs were arranged in a specific order, I realized later. Not chronologically, but by some other logic I couldn't grasp. The shadows in each image grew longer, darker, until the final photograph showed nothing but an empty room. No figure by the window, no furniture, just emptiness and that strange, angled light. I started checking the locks more frequently. The front door, the windows, the filing cabinets, everything secure, everything in its place, yet something felt perpetually out of alignment. Like a picture frame hung slightly crooked, barely noticeable but impossible to ignore once you've seen it. Her desk was cleaned out when I arrived the next morning. Drawers empty, personal items gone, even the small cactus she had kept by her computer monitor. No note, no explanation. The cleaning crew said they hadn't been instructed to clear anything out. They seemed genuinely confused by my questions. The dark sedan was gone from the parking lot. In its place, a oil stain shaped like a question mark. I knelt down and touched the pavement, expecting the stain to be fresh, but my fingers came away clean. The asphalt was bone dry. I called her number repeatedly. Each time, the phone rang exactly 4 times before going to voicemail. Her recorded message was brief, professional, revealing nothing. But in the background, I could hear something that might have been traffic, or wind, or the sound of breathing. The missing file reappeared on my desk, not where I had left it, but positioned precisely in the center of the blotter, aligned with the edges of the desk. Inside, the photographs were gone. In their place, a single sheet of paper with my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing the words. She knew what she was looking for. I began to doubt my own recollections. Had she really asked about the file, or had I imagined the subtle questions, the meaningful glances? Memory, I was learning, was less reliable than I had believed. It shifted and reformed like smoke, taking new shapes depending on the light. The key under the brick was gone. I checked multiple times, moving the brick completely, searching the surrounding area. Nothing, but when I tested the back door, it was unlocked. It opened with a soft click that echoed in the empty hallway. Inside, everything appeared normal. The papers were still stacked neatly. The coffee cup still sat on the desk, though the liquid inside had grown cold. I touched the rim and tasted salt, as if someone had been crying into the cup. The photographs had been taken from inside this very room. I realized this as I stood by the tall windows, watching shadows fall across the floor in those same impossible angles. The camera had been positioned exactly where I was standing, capturing the view I was seeing now. But the room in the photographs had been empty. No desk, no filing cabinets, no evidence of the work that consumed my days. Just bare walls and those strange, elongated shadows that seemed to point toward something just outside the frame. I found myself returning to the window repeatedly, trying to understand what the photographer had been documenting. The view was ordinary, the parking lot, a few trees, the building across the street, nothing that would warrant such careful documentation. Her voicemail box became full. The automated message informed me that no new messages could be accepted. I wondered who else had been calling, what other voices were trapped in that digital space, waiting to be heard. The handwriting on the paper troubled me. It looked like mine, but the letters were slightly more angular, the spacing different. As if someone had studied my writing carefully and reproduced it with minor variations, or as if I had written it in a state I couldn't remember. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in bed, listening to the sounds of the building settling, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional footstep in the hallway outside my apartment. Normal sounds that felt charged with significance, as if they were trying to tell me something I wasn't quite ready to hear. The coffee cup multiplied. One morning I found 3 identical cups on the desk, each filled with the same bitter liquid. I hadn't made coffee that morning. I was certain of this, yet the evidence suggested otherwise. I poured them out one by one and watched the dark liquid spiral down the drain. I began to suspect that she had never really left, that her cleaned-out desk was an elaborate deception, that she was still somewhere in the building, watching, waiting. I checked the other floors, the storage rooms, the basement, all empty, all silent, all perfectly ordinary. The photographs were in my apartment when I returned home, spread across my kitchen table like a puzzle waiting to be solved. But these were different images, taken from angles I didn't recognize, showing parts of the room I had never noticed before. A corner where the shadows gathered more thickly, a section of wall where the paint seemed to ripple. I gathered them up and drove to the river. The water was dark and moved slowly, carrying leaves and debris toward some distant destination. I held the photographs above the water, ready to let them fall, but something stopped me. Instead, I put them back in my jacket pocket and drove home. The key had returned to its hiding place under the brick, but now there were 2 keys, identical except for a small scratch on one that might have been deliberate or accidental. I took both keys and tried them in the back door. They both worked perfectly. She had been documenting something. This became clear as I pieced together the fragments of evidence she had left behind. The questions about the files, the photographs, the careful attention to details that seemed insignificant, but what she had discovered and why she had needed to disappear remained opaque. I found myself writing notes to her, letters I would never send, explanations for things I didn't understand. The act of writing helped organize my thoughts, but the words on paper looked foreign, as if someone else had guided my hand. The building felt different now. Corridors that had once been familiar seemed to stretch longer than before. Doors that I was certain had been painted white were now a pale blue, or maybe they had always been blue and I had simply never noticed. Details became unreliable, shifting when I wasn't paying attention. I started photographing everything: the desk, the windows, the parking lot, the shadows on the floor. I wanted to create my own record, something I could refer back to when memory failed. But when I developed the images, they showed things I hadn't seen through the viewfinder. Shapes in the background, movements at the edge of the frame. The dark sedan returned, different spot in the parking lot, but unmistakably the same vehicle. This time the license plate was clearly visible, though the combination of letters and numbers meant nothing to me. I wrote it down anyway, adding it to the collection of meaningless details that seemed important. I realized I had been wrong about the coffee. She hadn't made it for me. I had been making it for her every morning, a ritual I had forgotten until now. The bitter taste was because she preferred it that way, strong and black, no cream or sugar. I had been drinking her coffee, tasting her preferences, without understanding why. The last photograph was different from the others. It showed me standing by the window, but my face was turned toward the camera, eyes wide with an expression I didn't recognize. Fear, perhaps, or realization. I had no memory of posing for this image, no recollection of anyone taking my picture. The phone rang as I held the photograph. 4 rings, then silence. No voicemail, no recorded message, just the hollow sound of an empty line. I pressed the phone to my ear and listened to the static, wondering if she was listening too, somewhere on the other end of that digital void. The coffee cup was warm again when I touched it, steam rising in those familiar spirals that seemed to form shapes before dissolving into nothing. Story 4. It was a comforting cycle, a melody that repeated every morning just before dawn. The notes seemed to drift in through the cracks, a sequence so familiar it slipped easily into the background of waking thoughts. 3 chimes followed by a pause, then a 4th always the same. I had never paid much attention until last Tuesday when the 4th note lagged behind. The following day the interruption crept in earlier, the 4th note barely audible. By Friday, it never came at all. Yet today, as the first 3 notes played out like a ghost's touch, I felt an unfamiliar weight in the air. The coffee tastes different now, bitter in a way that makes me question whether I've been preparing it wrong all along or if something else has changed. I sit at the kitchen table, watching steam rise from the cup, and wonder if taste can be influenced by what we know, or what we think we know. There's a photograph tucked behind the sugar bowl. I found it weeks ago, maybe months' time has become unreliable lately. A woman standing beside a car, her face turned slightly away from the camera. The edges are worn soft, like someone handled it often. I don't remember taking it. I don't remember her. The neighbor's dog stopped barking 3 weeks before the 4th note disappeared. I realize this now, sitting here in the growing light, connecting details that seemed unrelated. The dog had barked every morning at exactly the same time the chimes would sound, a reliable irritation I'd grown accustomed to. Now there's only silence where both sounds used to live. I keep a journal, though I'm not sure when I started. The entries are written in my handwriting, but I don't recall writing most of them. Small observations, mostly. The mailman looked nervous today. Found dirt under my fingernails again. She was wearing the blue coat. I flipped through pages, searching for context that never comes. The blue coat hangs in my closet. I discovered it while looking for something else entirely what I can't remember. It's not mine, too small, wrong style. The fabric is expensive, well made. There's a small tear near the left pocket, carefully mended with thread that doesn't quite match. Someone took care with that repair. In the journal, I write about dreams that feel too real. Walking through rooms I don't recognize, opening doors that led to more doors, always searching for something just out of reach. The dreams have weight, substance. When I wake, my feet are sometimes dirty. The woman in the photograph might be someone I knew. Her posture suggests familiarity, the way she leans against the car like she belongs there. But faces can be deceiving. Memory can be kinder or crueler than truth, depending on what we need to believe. I find myself checking the locks more often now. Front door, back door, windows. The ritual brings temporary comfort, though I'm not sure what I'm keeping out or keeping in. My fingers trace the metal, testing the mechanism over and over. Sometimes the locks feel warm, as if someone else has touched them recently. The fourth note returns sporadically, unpredictably. When it comes, it sounds different, hollow, distant, like an echo of something that used to exist. I wait for it now, sitting by the window in the pre-dawn darkness, holding my breath during that pause. The anticipation has become more important than the sound itself. There are gaps in my days, moments where I'm suddenly somewhere else, doing something I don't remember starting. Standing in the backyard with a shovel in my hands, driving down unfamiliar roads with no destination in mind. The journal mentions these episodes but offers no explanation, just facts recorded in my careful handwriting. The mailman does look nervous. He approaches the box differently now, quickly, without his usual casual pace. Once I watched him from the window as he glanced toward the house, then hurried away without delivering anything. The next day there were 3 letters that should have come earlier, someone else's mail mixed in with mine. I study the photograph again. The car is familiar, same model as when I used to drive, though the color is wrong, or maybe my memory is wrong. The woman's hand rests on the hood in a gesture of ownership or farewell. Behind her, trees cast shadows that suggest late afternoon, but the light feels wrong for that time of day. The blue coat smells like perfume I don't recognize, something expensive, floral with an undertone of something sharper. When I hold it close, I feel dizzy, like standing at the edge of a high place. The mended tear is precise work, done by someone who cared about the garment, about the person who wore it. My dreams have begun to include sounds, the chimes, but also voices I can't quite understand, conversations happening just beyond my ability to follow. Sometimes I wake with words on my lips, fragments of responses to questions I didn't hear. The taste of those words stays with me all morning. The neighbor's house looks empty now. No lights in the evening, no car in the driveway. I haven't seen anyone coming or going, but that doesn't mean anything. People can be very quiet when they want to be, very careful about when they show themselves. I've started leaving the journal open on the kitchen table, curious to see if new entries appear. They do sometimes, notes about things I might have observed but don't remember noticing. The garden gate was open again, heard footsteps on the roof. She called but didn't leave a message. The handwriting is mine, but the timing feels impossible. The fourth note, when it comes now, seems to be calling for a response. I find myself humming along, trying to complete the sequence, but I don't know what comes after. The melody feels unfinished, like a question that needs an answer I don't have. In the photograph, the woman's shadow falls at an angle that doesn't match the other shadows in the frame. It's a small detail, the kind of thing you only notice after staring too long, but once seen, it changes everything about the image, makes it feel staged, deliberate, makes me wonder who was holding the camera. The coffee tastes normal again this morning. I'm not sure if that's a good sign or if I've simply adjusted to the change. Adaptation can be a form of forgetting, a way of moving forward without resolving what came before. I drink it anyway, grateful for any kind of consistency. The locks were all open when I checked them last night, every single one, though I distinctly remember securing them. I tell myself I must have forgotten, but my hands remember the motion of turning each mechanism. The metal was still warm, still holding the heat of recent contact. Today the fourth note came twice, once in its usual place, then again after a longer pause, softer but more insistent, like someone learning to play a song they'd only heard in memory. I wonder if I'm the only one listening, or if there are others who have noticed the change, others who are waiting for what comes next. The woman in the photograph is gone now. The image remains, but when I look at it, I see only the car, the trees, the strange light, as if she was never there at all. But the space where she stood feels heavy, significant, an absence that weighs more than presence ever did. And this morning, when I opened the journal to write, I found a page I'd never seen before. Just one line in my careful handwriting. Some melodies are meant to be completed by someone else. I don't remember writing it, but I understand what it means. The fourth note isn't missing. It's waiting for me to find it. Story 5. The doorbell didn't echo again. I pressed it twice, expecting the familiar chime, but all that greeted me was the muted weight of the air. My footsteps should have echoed down the hallway, but they absorbed into the carpet, leaving no trace of my presence. The walls appeared closer together, suffocating in their silence, as if they hungrily listened but refused to respond. A light switch clicked without illumination, leaving shadows to mock the absent glow. When I reached for the handrail, it felt forgetful, untouched by warmth or memory, as though it had been holding its breath all this time. The brass was cold under my palm, always cold, even in summer. I remember thinking that the first time I climbed these stairs, following her voice as it drifted down from the second floor. But now, standing here again, I wonder if I'm remembering correctly. The voice could have been coming from anywhere, could have been anyone. I pull my hand away and study the worn groove where countless fingers have gripped this same spot. The metal bears no fingerprints now, polished clean by time or intention. Or perhaps I'm seeing things that aren't there. The mind fills in details when the truth becomes too heavy to carry whole. The case file sits in my car, pages bent from too much handling. I could recite the timeline by heart, though each time I do, small inconsistencies creep in. Was it a Tuesday when she first called, or Wednesday? Did she mention the neighbor's dog, or was that from a different conversation entirely? Memory is a poor witness, unreliable and eager to please. She had said the house felt different. That was the word she used, different. Not wrong, not threatening. Just different, as if someone had moved all the furniture an inch to the left while she slept. I wrote it down in my notebook, the one with the coffee stain on page 12. The stain is shaped like a cloud, or maybe a bird, depends on how you hold it to the light. The floorboard creaks under my weight, the same protest it made that afternoon when I first walked through her front door. She was waiting in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. Steam no longer rose from the surface, but she held it like it might still offer warmth. It's the small things, she had told me, her voice barely above a whisper. The way the refrigerator hums a different tune, how the bathroom faucet drips in triplets instead of pairs. I remember nodding, though I wasn't sure I understood. Houses settle, I wanted to say. Pipes age. Appliances wear down, but something in her expression stopped me. Fear, maybe, or recognition of something I couldn't yet see. Now, months later, or has it been years, I find myself listening for that refrigerator's hum. The house breathes around me, its rhythm slightly off, like a heart with an irregular beat. The kitchen feels smaller than I remember, though the measurements would prove otherwise. Perspective shifts when you're looking for answers that may not exist. The mug still sits on the counter, or one just like it, white ceramic with a hairline crack running down the side. I touch the edge where her lips once pressed, feeling for warmth that isn't there. The crack has grown longer, I think, spread like a fault line through porcelain, splitting what was once whole into something fragile and compromised. In my notes, I wrote that she seemed tired, dark circles under her eyes, the kind that sleep couldn't cure. But looking back, I wonder if I was projecting. Maybe I was the tired one, carrying too many cases, too many unanswered questions. The mind seeks patterns even when none exist, connects dots that were never meant to form a picture. The phone records showed nothing unusual. 3 calls to her sister, 2 to the grocery store, 1 to a number that was disconnected when I tried to trace it. Normal patterns of a normal life, except for the feeling that something lurked beneath the surface. But feelings aren't evidence, they're just shadows cast by our own uncertainties. I walked to the window where she used to stand, looking out at the yard where nothing ever seemed to grow properly. The grass grows in patches, leaving bare spots like bald patches on an aging scalp. She mentioned seeing someone out there, a figure that appeared at dusk and disappeared when she turned on the porch light. Always just out of focus, she had said, like trying to see through water. I spent 3 evenings in that yard, hidden behind the oak tree with its peeling bark and twisted branches. Nothing appeared except the neighbor's cat, a tabby with white paws who hunted mice with single-minded determination. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Maybe I was looking in the wrong place, or at the wrong time, or with the wrong eyes. The basement door stands ajar, though I remember closing it during my last visit. The darkness beyond seems thicker than it should be, resistant to the weak light filtering down from above. She never liked going down there, said it smelled like old photographs and forgotten promises. I breathe in and catch something musty, tinged with sweetness, or maybe I'm imagining it. The nose, like memory, can be easily fooled. My footsteps sound different on the wooden stairs, hollow and distant. Each step echoes briefly before being swallowed by the space below. The basement is smaller than the footprint of the house suggests, though the blueprints would show the exact measurements. Perception warps in enclosed spaces, especially when you're searching for something that might not want to be found. Boxes line the walls, their contents labeled in fading ink. Christmas decorations, tax records, baby clothes, the mundane artifacts of a life lived in accumulation and storage. But one box sits apart from the others, its label too smudged to read. Inside, I find photographs of people I don't recognize, their faces smiling at a camera held by unknown hands. She's in some of the pictures, younger, her hair a different color, standing next to people who could be family or friends or strangers who happen to share a moment worth preserving. In one photo, she's looking over her shoulder, as if someone had called her name just as the shutter clicked. Her expression is hard to read: surprise, maybe, or concern. I hold the photograph to the light, studying the background for clues. A kitchen that might be this one, though the wallpaper is different. Or maybe it's a different kitchen entirely, in a different house, in a different time. The mind wants to make connections, to weave separate threads into a coherent narrative. But sometimes threads are just threads, leading nowhere but back to themselves. The interview transcripts fill 47 pages, single-spaced. Her words, my words, the spaces between them where meaning might hide. Reading them now, I notice how often she paused, how frequently she corrected herself or started sentences she never finished. Language failing to capture something that existed beyond words. It started with the doors, she had said during our third meeting. They would be open when I was sure I'd closed them, or closed when I remembered leaving them open. But in the second interview, she said it started with the sounds. Footsteps in the attic when no one was upstairs. The creak of floorboards in patterns that seemed almost like walking, almost like pacing. Memory is fluid, reshaping itself each time we access it. Truth becomes a moving target, impossible to pin down with any certainty. I close the transcript and look around the room where we sat, her in the blue chair by the window, me on the couch with its worn cushions and faded floral pattern. The chair is empty now, but I can almost see the impression her body left, the way the fabric held her shape long after she stood up. Almost, but not quite. The mind fills in details that may never have existed. The police report is 3 pages long, typed on a machine with a sticky E that left gaps in words like evidence and scene. Officers' observations, witness statements, a conclusion that satisfied no one but closed the file. Case resolved through administrative necessity rather than actual resolution. But I keep coming back to this house, drawn by questions that multiply rather than diminish. Each visit reveals new inconsistencies, new details that don't align with previous observations. The wallpaper in the hallway seems to have more roses than I remembered. The kitchen window faces east, not west as I wrote in my notes. Small discrepancies that could be explained by faulty memory or poor observation, or something else entirely. The attic ladder unfolds with a rusty screech, protesting weight it wasn't designed to bear. Above, the space stretches into darkness, insulation, and rafters, creating a landscape of shadows and possibility. She never went up here, claimed she was afraid of heights, but someone had been using this space. Footprints in the dust, disturbed only by time and my own intrusion. A single bulb hangs from a wire, casting harsh light that creates more shadows than it eliminates. In the corner, a pile of blankets suggests someone had been sleeping here, or maybe they're just old linens, stored and forgotten. The boundary between evidence and assumption blurs in spaces like this, where every object could be significant or meaningless. I find a notebook wedged between 2 rafters, its pages filled with handwriting I don't recognize. Lists of dates and times, observations about weather patterns and neighborhood activities. The writing grows less legible as the pages progress, as if the hand holding the pen was losing strength or certainty. Or maybe the light was failing. Darkness has a way of making everything unclear. The last entry is dated 3 days before she disappeared. Just 2 words, they know. But who are they and what did they know? The notebook offers no answers, only more questions that branch and multiply like cracks in glass. I photograph each page, though I'm not sure why. Evidence of what? Proof of whose involvement? The camera captures images but not meaning. Context remains elusive. Back in the kitchen, I make coffee in her machine, using grounds I found in the freezer. The ritual feels like trespassing, but also like communion. The coffee tastes bitter, over-extracted, but I drink it anyway, trying to taste what she tasted, see what she saw, understand what she understood. But understanding is a luxury I can't afford. All I have are fragments, pieces of a puzzle that may not have a solution. The neighbor from across the street had mentioned seeing lights in the house at odd hours. 3 in the morning, 4:30, just before dawn. Lights that moved from room to room in patterns that seemed purposeful but inexplicable. When I asked what kind of patterns, she couldn't say. Just movement, she said, like someone searching for something they'd lost. I turn on the lights now, room by room, trying to recreate those movements. Kitchen to living room to hallway to stairs. The sequence feels familiar, though I can't remember ever walking this route before. Muscle memory of actions I never took, or maybe I did take them and forgot. The mind protects itself by forgetting what it cannot process. In the bedroom, her clothes still hang in the closet, arranged by color and season. Dresses she wore to work, casual clothes for weekends, a single black dress that might have been for funerals or formal occasions. The fabric holds no scent now, washed clean by time and absence. But touching the sleeves, I imagine I can feel the shape of her arms, the warmth of life that once filled these empty garments. The bed is made with military precision, corners tucked and surface smooth. She was meticulous about such things, found comfort in order and routine, but the pillow on the right side bears a slight depression, as if someone had been lying there recently. Or maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist, finding significance in the random settling of fabric and foam. The bathroom mirror reflects my face, but also the room behind me, creating a doubled perspective that makes everything seem uncertain. In the reflection, I notice details I missed when looking directly. A towel folded differently than the others, a bottle of shampoo turned so its label faces the wall. Small disruptions in the careful order she maintained. Or maybe I'm the one disrupting things, my presence altering what should remain unchanged. I splash water on my face, and for a moment in the mirror I think I see someone else. A figure standing behind me, watching, but when I turn, the doorway is empty. Just shadows and imagination, my mind manufacturing threats to explain the unease I feel. Fear is contagious, spreading from her to me through proximity and suggestion. The investigation officially ended when they found her car by the lake, keys still in the ignition, doors unlocked. No signs of struggle, no indication of foul play, just absence where presence used to be. The lake gave up no secrets, its dark water keeping whatever truths it might hold. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, buried beneath surfaces we cannot penetrate. But I keep returning to this house, as if the building itself might eventually speak. Walls that witnessed whatever happened, floors that remember the weight of footsteps, doors that opened and closed on scenes I can only imagine. The house knows, but houses don't testify. They only wait, patient and silent, holding their secrets until time renders them irrelevant. The sun sets through the kitchen window, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. This was her favorite time of day, she had told me, when the light was soft and forgiving, making everything beautiful even if only temporarily. I understand now why she loved these moments. Beauty provides comfort when truth offers none. I gather my things, notebook, camera, the coffee mug I shouldn't have used, and prepare to leave. The house will return to its waiting, its patient silence, but I'll carry its mysteries with me, adding them to the collection of unanswered questions that define my work. Some cases close themselves through resolution. Others remain open forever, bleeding into dreams and quiet moments when the mind has nothing else to occupy its attention. As I reach for the door handle, I notice something I missed before. A single fingerprint on the brass, clear and distinct, fresh enough to suggest recent contact, but whose? Mine from earlier, hers preserved somehow against time and cleaning, or someone else entirely, someone who has been here since I last visited. I photographed the print, though I'm not sure what I'll do with the image. Evidence requires context, and context requires understanding I don't possess. The fingerprint could be crucial or meaningless, a clue or a coincidence. In the absence of certainty, everything becomes potentially significant and simultaneously worthless. The door closes behind me with a soft click, sealing the house back into its silence. But the questions follow me to the car, settle into the passenger seat like an unwelcome companion. What did she know? Who did she fear? What truth was too dangerous to speak aloud? Driving away, I catch a glimpse of the house in my rearview mirror. For just a moment, I think I see a light in an upstairs window, a warm glow that suggests presence and life. But when I break and look again, the house is dark, empty, waiting. just as it always has been, just as it always will be. The case file will return to its drawer, joining the others that resist resolution. But the house will remain patient and knowing, holding its secrets like a closed fist. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I'll find myself walking those hallways again, searching for answers that dance just beyond reach, always one step ahead of understanding. Truth, I've learned, is not always meant to be found. Sometimes it's enough to know that mysteries exist, that some questions are more important than their answers. The search itself becomes the destination, and uncertainty becomes a form of faith. In the end, we are all just visitors in houses that remember more than they reveal, witnesses to stories we can never fully understand. Story 6. It was far past midnight when I found myself fixed on the dim outline of the hallway, the darkness a canvas of indistinct shapes and muted breaths. Each tick of the clock seemed to linger longer, more drawn out than the last, as though time was reluctant to move forward. Shadows from the streetlight painted curious patterns across the floor, but they remained unmoving, undisturbed. Yet a creeping disquiet pricked at my consciousness. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. And then, as if in response to an unvoiced question, a draft brushed my cheek, a reminder of a window I hadn't opened. The sensation pulls me back, always back to that same draft, that same coolness against skin that shouldn't have been there. My fingers trace the windowsill now, months later, feeling for something I can't name. The paint is smooth, unmarked, no scratches, no signs of forced entry. The detective had said that too, hadn't he? Or was it the other one, the younger officer with the nervous habit of clicking his pen? I remember the sound of that pen. Click, 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 like a metronome counting down to something I couldn't see coming. The case file sits on my kitchen table, pages worn soft from handling. Coffee rings stain the corners where I've set my cup down, forgotten, while reading the same witness statements over and over. The words blur together sometimes. Names become meaningless. Facts dissolve into impressions. She lived 3 blocks away, or was it 4? The address keeps shifting in my memory, numbers rearranging themselves like puzzle pieces that don't quite fit. What I remember clearly is her laugh. High and musical, carrying across the courtyard that evening when we'd all gathered for the building's summer barbecue. She'd been wearing something blue or green. The color changes depending on the light in my memory. "Did you know her well?" the detective had asked. I'd said no, but that wasn't entirely true, was it? We'd shared those small intimacies that neighbors do. Borrowed sugar, collected mail during vacations. She'd watered my plants once when I was sick. I'd found them drooping anyway when I returned, but I'd thanked her. Politeness covering disappointment. The photograph in the newspaper showed her smiling. Professional headshot, probably from work. Insurance adjuster, the article said. I wondered who chose that picture. Who decided that particular smile would represent her in death. There were other photos on her social media. I'd looked. We all had, probably. The ones at the beach, the ones with friends at restaurants, the ones where she looked tired, human, imperfect. But they used the professional one, the one where she looked like someone who had never experienced doubt. My coffee has gone cold again. I pour it down the sink and watch the dark liquid swirl away. The kitchen window faces her building, faced. The building is still there, of course. Her apartment is still there. Someone else lives in it now. I've seen lights on at night, different patterns, different rhythms. The timeline never made sense to me. She'd left work at 5:30. Security cameras confirmed it. Her car was found in the parking garage beneath her building at 6:15. But her keycard wasn't used to access her apartment until nearly 8. Where had she been for those hours? What had she been doing? Running errands, the report suggested. Stopped for dinner somewhere. But no one found receipts. No one found witnesses. No one found any trace of those missing hours except the absence they left behind. I think about absence a lot now, how it is weight, how it fills spaces instead of emptying them. Her absence fills that apartment across the way. It fills the mailbox that used to overflow with catalogs and bills. It fills the parking space that stays empty even though someone new should be using it. The draft touches my cheek again. I turn toward the window, but it's closed. It's always closed now. I check it 3-4 times before bed. The lock is secure. The latch is tight, but the draft comes anyway, carrying with it the scent of rain that hasn't fallen. In my dreams, I'm walking through her apartment. The layout is wrong rooms where there shouldn't be rooms, hallways that lead nowhere. But the feeling is right, that sense of interruption, of something left unfinished. A book open to a page she'll never turn. A coffee cup half empty on the counter. A bed unmade, sheets twisted as if she'd just gotten up. The detective's notes mention the bed, appeared slept in. But what does that mean exactly? Slept in by whom? When? The timestamp on her building security footage showed her entering at 7:47 p.m. The medical examiner estimated time of death between midnight and 2 a.m. 6 hours. What had she done during those 6 hours? I find myself counting time differently now, not in minutes or hours, but in possibilities. In choices that branch and split like cracks in glass. She could have called someone, she could have ordered takeout, she could have watched television, she could have packed a suitcase, she could have written a letter, she could have changed her mind about something important. The police found no suitcase, no letter, no evidence of phone calls after 6 p.m. The television was off. The takeout containers in her refrigerator were from the week before. But they found the window open. That's what keeps circling back to me. The window in her bedroom, the one that faced the fire escape. Open just wide enough for the night air to slip through, just wide enough for that draft I keep feeling. Could have been opened from inside, the report noted. No signs of external entry. Could have been the language of uncertainty, the language of cases that never quite close, even when they're officially closed. I've walked past her building countless times since then, always at different hours, never with any real destination in mind, just walking, just looking. The fire escape clings to the brick like a metal skeleton, 3rd floor, her floor. The window is closed now, curtains drawn, but I remember how it looked that night when the police cars arrived. Open, dark, breathing. The official cause of death was listed as accidental. Fall from height, no evidence of foul play, no evidence of intent, just an accident, they said. A terrible accident. But accidents have explanations. They have sequences of events that lead logically from cause to effect. She was in her apartment, then she was on the pavement below. What happened in between? What carried her from safety to falling? I've stood at my own window and tried to imagine it, the physics of it, the psychology of it. You don't accidentally fall from a 3rd floor window. You don't accidentally climb out onto a fire escape in the middle of the night. You don't accidentally let go. Unless someone was chasing you, unless you were running from something, unless the alternative to falling was worse than falling. But there was no evidence of anyone else in the apartment, no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no DNA under her fingernails, nothing to suggest she hadn't been alone. The neighbors heard nothing unusual. The building's hallways were empty. The security cameras showed no one entering or leaving after her arrival at 7:47. She was alone, and then she was falling, and then she was gone. I keep a notebook now, pages filled with questions that don't have answers, timelines that don't add up, connections that might not be connections at all. The handwriting gets smaller as the pages progress, as if I'm trying to fit more truth into less space. Sometimes I write down things I remember about her, the way she always wore her hair pulled back, the way she walked quickly, purposefully, as if she was always late for something important, the way she'd nod when we passed in the hallway, polite but distant, the way she'd seemed in those final weeks to be looking over her shoulder. Had she been looking over her shoulder, or is that something I've added to the memory, a detail that feels true even if it isn't? Memory is unreliable, I know this, I've read about it, how we reconstruct rather than remember, how each recollection changes the thing being recalled, how the act of remembering becomes an act of creation. So maybe she wasn't looking over her shoulder. Maybe she wasn't walking more quickly. Maybe she wasn't avoiding eye contact in the hallway. Maybe I've built a story around a tragedy, turning an accident into a mystery because mysteries feel more meaningful than accidents. But then I feel the draft again, and I remember the window I hadn't opened, and I wonder if some truths exist in the spaces between what we can prove and what we can't forget. The case file has a section for witness statements. Mine is there, 3 paragraphs of careful neutrality. Neighbor in adjacent building. No unusual activity observed. No significant interaction with deceased. Accurate and completely useless. What I didn't tell them was about the phone call. 3 days before she died, my phone had rung at nearly 11 p.m. When I answered, there was only breathing. Soft, careful breathing, as if someone was trying not to be heard. I'd said hello twice before the line went dead. Wrong number, I'd thought, accidental dial. It happened all the time. But the next morning, I'd seen her at her kitchen window, and she'd looked directly at me, really looked, not just the usual neighborly glance, and I'd wondered if maybe it hadn't been a wrong number after all. I never mentioned it to the police because it seemed insignificant, because it probably was insignificant, because the connection I felt might have been nothing more than coincidence and guilt and the human need to find patterns where none exist. But late at night, when the draft touches my cheek and I'm standing at the window looking across at her building, I wonder what she might have wanted to say. What words had been caught behind that careful breathing, what help she might have been asking for. The new tenant keeps different hours, lights on until dawn sometimes, then dark for days at a time. I don't know anything about them, him, her, them. I haven't tried to find out. Some distances are better maintained. But I watch the window, the one that used to be open, the one that used to breathe. It stays closed now, sealed tight against the night air, against drafts that carry questions without answers, against the possibility that some accidents aren't accidents at all, but choices made in moments too dark and desperate to imagine. The clock ticks toward morning, time moving forward again, reluctant but persistent. The shadows from the streetlight shift as the hours pass, painting new patterns across the floor. But the draft remains constant, a cool reminder that some windows once opened can never quite be closed. I close my notebook and turn away from the window. Tomorrow I'll read the case file again. I'll trace the timeline again. I'll wonder about those missing hours again. And maybe, if I'm very still and very careful, I'll remember something new, something true, something that explains the space between living and falling. Or maybe I'll just feel the draft and wonder why some questions insist on being asked, even when no one is left to answer them. Story 7. I told them the package was already on the table when I arrived. The creaking wood seemed to disagree with a certainty of its own, each step whispering stories of weight and movement. My hand brushed the edge, feeling a warmth that told tales of recent presence, a touch left behind like a shadow. The air hung with a mix of lavender and something sharper, something that bit the back of my throat with every breath. The sunlight barely made it through the curtains, casting fractured patterns that danced chaotically over the carpet. The corner, obscured in shadow, held its secrets tightly, yet the faint pulse in my temples synchronized with an unacknowledged reality. Everything was quiet except the silence between my thoughts. The brown paper wrapping, that's what I keep coming back to, not the contents, though I should remember those better. The paper was folded with surgical precision, each crease sharp enough to cut. Someone had taken care with it, someone who understood the importance of presentation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The key was under the planter, just like always, just like it had been for months. The metal was cold against my palm, and when I turned it in the lock, the mechanism gave that familiar resistance before yielding. The door swung open with a sigh, as if the house had been holding its breath. I wasn't supposed to be there, that much I remember clearly. The arrangement had been different, hadn't it? Someone was supposed to meet me, or maybe I was supposed to wait. The details blur together like watercolors in rain. The floorboards announced my presence with each step. Old houses do that, they're terrible at keeping secrets. But this house had been keeping them anyway, hadn't it? In the spaces between walls, in the basement I never went down to, in the attic where dust motes danced in shafts of light like tiny ghosts. The package sat in the center of the dining room table like a centerpiece at a dinner party nobody wanted to attend. Rectangular, about the size of a shoebox, but heavier somehow. Not in weight, I hadn't picked it up yet, but in presence. It commanded the room. My fingers traced the edge of the table again. The warmth was undeniable. Someone had been leaning against it, resting their palms on the wood while they looked at what I was looking at now. The thought made my skin crawl, though I couldn't say why. The handwriting on the package was careful, deliberate, block letters in black ink that hadn't had time to fade. My name written in a hand I should have recognized but didn't, or maybe I did, and that was worse. I keep trying to remember what came next, but the sequence fragments. Did I open it immediately? Did I walk around it first, studying it from different angles like it might reveal something new? Did I call someone? The phone, there was definitely a phone call. The old rotary model on the kitchen counter, its receiver heavy in my hand. But who did I call? The number came to me automatically, muscle memory guiding my fingers around the dial, ring after ring echoing in my ear until... You weren't supposed to be there yet. The voice was familiar but distorted, like hearing someone speak underwater. Concerned maybe, or was it angry? The tone shifts in my memory, becoming something else each time I replay it. The package, I said, though I'm not sure those were my exact words. It's here. Silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of breathing that might not have been mine. Don't touch it, wait for me. But I had already touched it, hadn't I? My fingerprints were on the paper, on the table, on everything. Evidence of my presence scattered throughout the house like breadcrumbs leading back to me. The curtains moved without any wind. I noticed that while I was on the phone, how they swayed gently as if someone had just brushed past them. The windows were closed. I had checked them when I arrived, part of that automatic survey you do when entering an empty space, making sure you're alone. Making sure you're safe. The lavender scent was stronger near the package. It clung to the paper like perfume, but underneath it lurked something else, something medicinal, something that reminded me of hospitals and waiting rooms and conversations held in hushed tones. I set the phone down without saying goodbye. The dial tone hummed in the empty kitchen until I finally hung up properly, the receiver settling into its cradle with a soft click. Back in the dining room, the package seemed to have shifted, not moved exactly, but changed somehow. The shadows fell differently across its surface, or maybe the light had changed. Time does strange things when you're not paying attention to it. The paper tore easily under my fingers, too easily, as if it had been scored, prepared for this moment. Inside, nestled in tissue paper the color of old bones, was... My memory stutters here, stops and starts like an old film reel catching in the projector. What I found should be clear, should be burned into my consciousness, but instead there's just an impression, a shape, a weight in my hands that felt wrong somehow. The front door opened while I was staring at it, footsteps in the hallway, purposeful and familiar. Someone who knew where they were going, who had been here before. You opened it. Not a question, an observation delivered in that same underwater voice from the phone. I turned, but the figure in the doorway was backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through the open door, a silhouette without features, without identity. I had to, I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. Had I had to, or had I simply wanted to? The distinction felt important, but I couldn't grasp why. Now you've signed it. Again, not a question. We stood there in the golden light, two people who knew each other well enough to skip the pleasantries, poorly enough to avoid eye contact. The air between us thrummed with unspoken things. What am I supposed to do with it? The question hung in the air like smoke. The figure moved closer, footsteps muffled by the carpet, and I caught a whiff of that same lavender scent. It was coming from them, not the package, had been all along. The same thing you did with the last one. The last one, the words hit me like cold water, bringing with them a flood of half-memories. Another package, another room, another conversation just like this one, with the same careful choreography of revelation and concealment. How many times had we done this? My hands were shaking. I looked down at them, at the thing I was holding, and for a moment I saw it clearly, really saw it, the shape, the texture, the implications of its existence. Then the moment passed, and it was just an object again, innocent, meaningless. I don't remember, I said, and it was the most honest thing I'd said all day. You never do. The figure moved to the window, adjusting the curtains with practiced ease. The light shifted, throwing new shadows across the room. Everything looked different now, unfamiliar. Why do you keep bringing them to me? But when I turned around, I was alone. The front door stood open, letting in the afternoon breeze. It stirred the torn wrapping paper on the table, making it rustle like autumn leaves. I walked to the door and looked out at the empty street. No car in the driveway, no footprints in the dust. No evidence that anyone had been there at all, except for the lingering scent of lavender and the package on the table. The package I was supposed to have opened. The package that was waiting for me when I arrived. But I had opened it, hadn't I? The paper was torn, the contents revealed. So why did it look untouched when I returned to the dining room? Why was the wrapping intact, my name still written clearly across the top in those careful block letters? I reached for it again, and my hand passed through it like smoke. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape you thought you knew. I wasn't remembering this. I was living it. Again. The same sequence of events, the same discoveries, the same questions without answers. The phone rang in the kitchen. That old rotary model with its insistent, mechanical cry. I knew who it would be before I answered. You weren't supposed to be there yet. But I was there, I had been there before, I would be there again. The package waited on the table, patient as a predator. The brown paper wrapping caught the light, and for just a moment I could see through it to what lay inside. Something that belonged to me, something I had lost. Something I had forgotten I was looking for. The warmth under my palm when I touched the table's edge wasn't from someone else's presence. It was mine. My own heat, absorbed by the wood during previous visits, previous discoveries, previous moments of standing in this exact spot and trying to piece together a puzzle that kept changing shape. The lavender scent grew stronger, and I realized it wasn't coming from the package or from some mysterious visitor. It was coming from me, from my clothes, my hair, my skin. I had been here so many times that the house had begun to smell like me. Or maybe I had begun to smell like the house. The creaking floorboards whispered their stories of weight and movement, but they were all the same story. The same footsteps, walking the same path, approaching the same revelation that slipped away like water the moment I grasped it. I told them the package was already on the table when I arrived. But who was them, and why did I need to tell them anything at all? The questions multiplied like reflections in opposing mirrors, each one generating new uncertainties, new possibilities. The house held its secrets tightly, but maybe the secret was that there were no secrets. Maybe there was only this, an endless loop of discovery and forgetting, of reaching for answers that dissolved the moment they were touched. The sunlight barely made it through the curtains, casting fractured patterns that danced chaotically over the carpet. In those shifting shapes, I could almost see the truth, almost understand why I kept coming back, why the package kept waiting, why the conversation always ended the same way. But almost isn't enough, and understanding is a luxury I can't seem to afford. So I reach for the package again, feel the careful creases of the brown paper wrapping, and prepare to discover what I've already forgotten. The silence between my thoughts grows louder, drowning out everything else until all that remains is the pulse in my temples and the weight of unacknowledged reality pressing down like a storm that never quite breaks. Story 8. I stood in the dimly lit room, my eyes tracing the outline of a shadow that didn't seem to belong. The ceiling fan above spun lazily, casting distorted shapes that danced along the walls. A draft brushed past, sending a chill that hinted at something more. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. The old clock on the mantel ticked steadily, yet the echo felt misplaced, like a heartbeat skipping where it shouldn't. My gaze caught a glimpse of something in the corner, a flicker that hadn't been there moments before. Then it was gone again, swallowed by the dark. The house had been empty for weeks, or so they told me. I'd been hired to assess the property, to determine what remained of value after the incident. The family had moved out suddenly, leaving behind the debris of their interrupted lives. Coffee cups still sat on the kitchen counter, their contents long since evaporated into brown stains. A child's drawing hung crooked on the refrigerator, held by a single magnet shaped like a sunflower. I moved through the rooms methodically, cataloging what I found. In the master bedroom, the bed remained unmade, sheets twisted as if someone had left in distress. The closet door stood ajar, revealing clothes that hung at odd angles, some fallen to the floor. There was an odor here that I couldn't identify, not decay, not neglect, but something organic and unsettling that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The basement drew me despite my reluctance to descend. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, each sound amplified in the enclosed space. The air grew thicker as I descended, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something that reminded me of copper pennies left too long in a pocket. Down there, among boxes of forgotten belongings and furniture draped in dust-covered sheets, I found the first photograph. It had been tucked between the pages of a water-damaged photo album, as if someone had tried to hide it but hadn't quite succeeded. The image showed a family gathering, faces smiling at the camera with the forced cheerfulness of a posed shot. But one face caught my attention, a man standing slightly apart from the others, his expression somehow different from the rest. I studied that photograph for a long while, trying to understand what disturbed me about it. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes, and his posture suggested tension despite the celebratory nature of the scene. Behind him, barely visible in the background, was a window. Through that window, I could make out another figure, someone who appeared to be watching from outside. The next photograph I discovered told a different story. Same family, similar setting, but the man who had seemed so separate in the first image now stood at the center of the group, his arm around a woman who leaned into him with apparent affection. The window in the background was empty this time, curtains drawn shut. I compared the two images, searching for clues about when they might have been taken, but found none. As I continued my exploration, I began to notice inconsistencies in the house itself. Furniture had been moved, not recently but deliberately. Scratches on the hardwood floors traced paths where heavy objects had been dragged from one location to another. In the living room, a pale rectangle on the wallpaper marked where a large picture frame had once hung. The nail remained, but whatever had been displayed there was gone. I found myself returning to that first room repeatedly, drawn by the persistent sense that something remained hidden there. The shadow I'd noticed initially seemed to shift position each time I entered, though I knew this was impossible. The ceiling fan continued its lazy rotation, creating the same hypnotic pattern of movement and stillness. On my third visit to the room, I noticed that the clock on the mantel had stopped. Its hands pointed to a specific arrangement that meant nothing to me, yet felt significant somehow. I approached the timepiece and discovered that it wasn't broken. The mechanism still functioned when I wound it. Someone had deliberately stopped it at that precise moment. The silence in the house began to feel oppressive. Even my own breathing seemed too loud, too intrusive in the stillness. I found myself moving more carefully, placing my feet with deliberate precision to minimize the sound of my footsteps. This caution felt necessary, though I couldn't explain why. In the kitchen, I opened drawers and cabinets, searching for clues about the family's sudden departure. Most contained the usual detritus of daily life utensils, expired medications, utility bills marked with red stamps indicating overdue payments. But in one drawer I found a collection of keys that didn't seem to belong to the house. They were old-fashioned, made of brass and iron, the kind that might open doors in buildings constructed decades earlier. I tested these keys on every lock I could find in the house, but none fit. Their purpose remained a mystery, yet someone had kept them carefully organized in a small wooden box lined with faded velvet. Each key had been wrapped in tissue paper, as if they were precious artifacts rather than functional tools. The telephone in the hallway still worked, though it had been disconnected from service. When I lifted the receiver, I heard not the expected silence, but a faint crackling sound, like static from a distant radio station. Sometimes within that static, I thought I could detect voices, though I could never make out the words they spoke. I began to suspect that my assessment of the property was not the real reason I'd been brought here. The person who'd hired me had been vague about the details of the incident that had driven the family away. When I'd asked direct questions, the responses had been evasive, filled with phrases like unfortunate circumstances and better left undisturbed. The more I explored, the more I realized that someone had been living in the house after the family's departure, not squatting or breaking in, but inhabiting the space with familiarity and care. Food in the refrigerator showed signs of recent consumption. A book lay open on the coffee table, its pages marked with fresh annotations in pencil. The bed in the guest room had been slept in, its sheets still holding the faint impression of a human form. I tried to piece together a timeline of events, but the evidence contradicted itself. Some signs pointed to recent occupation, while others suggested the house had been empty for much longer. The dust patterns on surfaces didn't match what I would expect from consistent habitation, yet personal items appeared to have been moved and used regularly. In the study, I found a journal that had been left open to a page filled with cramped handwriting. The entries described daily activities with mundane precision: meals eaten, television programs watched, phone calls received. But as I read more carefully, I noticed that the same events were described multiple times, as if the writer had forgotten recording them previously. The handwriting itself seemed to change subtly from entry to entry, sometimes appearing more rushed, other times more deliberate. The final entry in the journal was different from the others. Instead of describing routine activities, it contained a single sentence repeated over and over until it filled the entire page. The words themselves were innocuous, something about remembering to water the plants, but their repetition created an unsettling rhythm that seemed to echo in my mind long after I'd stopped reading. I found myself questioning my own perceptions as I continued through the house. Had I actually seen that shadow moving, or was it simply the play of light from the ceiling fan? Were the voices in the telephone static real, or had my imagination supplied them? The boundary between observation and interpretation began to blur, leaving me uncertain about what I could trust. The photographs I discovered in the basement multiplied as I searched more thoroughly. Each image revealed new details that contradicted what I'd seen in the others. The family's composition seemed to shift, sometimes including additional members, sometimes missing people who'd appeared in previous shots. The backgrounds changed as well, showing the same rooms but with different arrangements of furniture and decorations. One photograph particularly disturbed me. It showed the room where I'd first noticed the wayward shadow, but the image had been taken from an impossible angle, as if the camera had been positioned inside the wall itself. The perspective revealed details that couldn't be seen from any normal vantage point, including objects that I hadn't found during my physical search of the space. I began to suspect that someone was watching me as I worked. The sensation started as a vague unease, but grew stronger with each passing hour. I found myself glancing over my shoulder frequently, checking empty doorways and scanning windows for signs of observation. The house's mirrors became sources of anxiety, their reflections seeming to show movement in spaces I knew were empty. My sleep became troubled when I decided to stay overnight to complete my assessment. The guest room bed was comfortable enough, but I found myself lying awake listening to the house's nighttime sounds. Floors creaked with what might have been settling wood or careful footsteps. Pipes groaned and whispered behind the walls. The heating system cycled on and off with mechanical regularity, yet sometimes I heard it running when the thermostat indicated it should be silent. I woke once to find my notebook open beside the bed, though I was certain I'd closed it before sleeping. New writing had appeared on the page, not in my handwriting, but in the same cramped script I'd seen in the journal. The words described my own activities from the previous day, but with details I didn't remember and interpretations that seemed to come from someone else's perspective. The basement drew me back repeatedly. though I'd already cataloged everything it contained. Each visit revealed new hiding places I'd missed before, spaces behind the furnace, gaps between ceiling joists, corners obscured by accumulated debris. In these hidden areas, I found more evidence of the house's complicated history, additional photographs, handwritten notes, and objects that seemed significant but whose meaning eluded me. One note, written on paper torn from a prescription pad, contained what appeared to be a confession. The handwriting was shaky, as if written under stress, and described actions that might have been criminal or might have been perfectly innocent, depending on interpretation. The language was deliberately ambiguous, using phrases that could mean multiple things simultaneously. I tried to verify the information in the note by examining other evidence I'd found, but nothing provided clear confirmation or contradiction. The photographs could support various interpretations of events. The journal entries were too vague to be definitive. Even the physical evidence in the house could be explained in multiple ways, none more convincing than the others. The keys I discovered earlier began to obsess me. I carried them with me as I moved through the house, trying them on every lock and examining every door and cabinet for keyholes I might have missed. Their weight in my pocket became a constant reminder of secrets that remained locked away, knowledge that hovered just beyond my reach. On my final day in the house, I made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind a loose baseboard in the room where I'd first seen the shadow, I found a small tape recorder. The device was old but functional, its battery compartment corroded but still capable of holding a charge. A single cassette tape was loaded inside, its label blank except for a date written in faded ink. I played the tape, expecting to hear voices or music, but instead found only the sounds of daily life in the house. Footsteps moving from room to room, doors opening and closing, the television playing in the background. Occasionally I could hear breathing, sometimes heavy and labored, other times soft and regular. The recording seemed to span several hours, capturing the rhythm of someone's ordinary day. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that the sounds didn't match what I would expect from normal household activities. The footsteps followed patterns that made no sense, circling rooms repeatedly, stopping for long periods in empty spaces, moving between floors with unusual frequency. The breathing sometimes occurred in locations where no one should have been present, based on the other sounds on the recording. Most disturbing was the realization that some of the sounds on the tape matched activities I'd performed during my own time in the house. The creak of specific floorboards, the sound of particular doors opening, even my own breathing patterns seemed to be captured on a recording that predated my arrival by months or possibly years. I found myself questioning whether I was the first person to be sent to assess this property. Had others come before me, following the same path through the rooms, making the same discoveries, reaching the same confused conclusions? The tape suggested a cycle of investigation and departure that might have repeated itself multiple times. The shadow in that first room seemed more substantial now, as if my awareness of it had somehow strengthened its presence. I could no longer dismiss it as a trick of light or an artifact of the ceiling fan's rotation. It moved with purpose, responding to my movements in ways that suggested intelligence and intention. I began to wonder if I was documenting the house's secrets or becoming part of them. My own notebook entries started to sound like the journal I'd found, describing events with the same obsessive detail and repetitive patterns. I caught myself writing the same observations multiple times, as if I'd forgotten recording them previously. The telephone's static grew more distinct, resolving into what sounded like conversations between multiple people. I couldn't understand the words, but the emotional tone was clear urgency, fear, and something that might have been guilt. Sometimes I thought I recognized my own voice among the speakers, though I'd never used that phone to make any calls. My final night in the house passed without sleep. I sat in the room where everything had started, watching the shadow as it moved through its incomprehensible patterns. The ceiling fan continued its lazy rotation, the clock on the mantel resumed its steady ticking, and the draft carried scents I still couldn't identify. As dawn approached, I realized that I'd become part of whatever had happened in this house. The photographs would now include images of me, the journal would contain entries in my handwriting, and the tape recorder would preserve the sounds of my presence. Future investigators would find the same clues I'd discovered, plus new ones that documented my own involvement in the ongoing mystery. I left the house that morning with more questions than answers. The shadow remained in its room, the keys stayed in their drawer, and the tape recorder continued its patient documentation. Someone else would eventually be hired to assess the property, to determine what remained of value after another incident. They would find evidence of my presence alongside traces of all the others who had tried to understand what couldn't be explained. The truth, if it existed at all, remained locked away behind doors that might not have physical existence. The keys I'd found might open those doors, or they might be artifacts of hope left behind by previous seekers. The shadow might be a remnant of past events, or it might be a preview of future ones. I drove away from the house knowing that I would never fully understand what I'd experienced there. The investigation had changed me in ways I couldn't yet comprehend, adding my story to a collection that seemed to grow with each telling. Somewhere behind me, the house waited for its next visitor, its rooms holding their breath once again, ready to reveal and conceal their secrets in equal measure. Story 9. I mentioned that nothing looked out of the ordinary. It was easy to say, so they believed me. The air, however, was heavy with the scent of burnt toast, a lingering bitterness that dug into my throat. Dust had settled in odd patterns on the wooden shelf, as if something had been hastily moved. The crimson thread, barely visible, was tangled in the fabric of the old chair. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a serpentine shadow that coiled on the stained carpet. I kept my hands in my pockets, hiding the ash smudged on my fingertips. The silence felt endless, stretching out like old paint starting to peel. Everything seemed in place. The detectives nodded, scribbling notes that would later become part of an official report. I watched them work, feeling oddly detached from the scene unfolding in what had been her living room just hours before. They asked standard questions about our relationship, about the last time I'd seen her, about whether she'd seemed troubled lately. I answered each one with the practiced calm of someone who'd already processed the shock. She'd been my neighbor for 3 years. We shared morning coffee sometimes, talked about the weather, complained about the landlord's reluctance to fix the heating. Normal things, comfortable things. When I found her that morning, slumped in that old chair by the window, it seemed clear what had happened. The stress had finally gotten to her. The divorce proceedings, the job loss, the mounting bills scattered across her kitchen table. It all painted a picture that made perfect sense. The paramedics had arrived first, then the police, then the detectives. Standard procedure for any unexpected death, they explained. Nothing suspicious, just paperwork to complete. I told them about hearing a thud through the thin walls around Dawn, about knocking on her door when she didn't answer, about using the spare key she'd given me for emergencies. Everything happened exactly as I described it. The detective with the gray mustache asked about the burnt smell. I explained that she often made toast in the mornings, sometimes burned it when she was distracted. He seemed satisfied with that explanation. His partner, a younger woman with sharp eyes, walked around the room taking photos. She paused at the shelf, studying the dust patterns I'd noticed earlier. "Did she collect anything?" she asked. "Books mostly, some small pottery pieces her grandmother left her." "Any missing?" I considered this carefully. I wouldn't know. I wasn't here often enough to memorize her decorations. This was true, or at least mostly true. I'd been in her apartment perhaps a dozen times over the years, usually just standing in the doorway while she grabbed something or returned a borrowed item. The living room had always felt cluttered to me, filled with the accumulated weight of a life lived in small spaces. The detectives finished their preliminary examination and told me they'd be in touch if they needed anything else. The coroner's team arrived as they were leaving. I watched from my own doorway as they wheeled her out, a shape under white cloth that seemed smaller than the person I'd known. That evening I sat in my kitchen trying to process what had happened. The walls between our apartments were thin enough that I'd grown accustomed to the rhythms of her daily routine. The morning coffee grinder, the evening television programs, the occasional phone conversations that carried through the shared wall. Now there was only silence. I made myself dinner and tried to remember the last conversation we'd had. It must have been several days earlier, maybe a week. She'd mentioned something about cleaning out old papers, getting her affairs in order. At the time, I'd assumed she meant organizing for the divorce. People going through major life changes often felt the need to declutter, to create some sense of control over their circumstances. But as I replayed that conversation, something nagged at me. The way she'd looked when she said it, a kind of distant expression that didn't quite match her words, and there had been something else, something about her hands. They'd been stained with what looked like soot or charcoal. When I'd asked about it, she'd brushed the question away, said she'd been cleaning out the fireplace. This struck me as odd now because I'd never seen her use the fireplace. The building was old, and most of the fireplaces had been sealed decades ago for safety reasons. I'd assumed hers was purely decorative, like mine. The next morning, I found myself listening for sounds that would never come. The absence of a routine created a strange vacuum in my own daily rhythm. I realized how much I'd unconsciously relied on the familiar noises from next door to mark the passage of time. I made coffee and stood at my kitchen window, looking down at the courtyard below. That's when I noticed the scorch marks on the brick wall outside what would have been her living room window. Dark streaks that looked recent, as if something had been burning and the smoke had stained the exterior wall. The landlord arrived that afternoon to change the locks and begin the process of clearing out her apartment. He was a practical man who dealt with tenant deaths before, though he seemed genuinely sorry about this one. She'd been a good renter, he said. Quiet, paid on time, never caused problems. "Did she ever mention issues with the fireplace?" I asked him. He looked puzzled. Fireplace, those were all sealed up when I bought the building. Insurance requirement. Why? I told him about the scorch marks outside. He frowned and said he'd have someone look at it, probably just staining from the building's heating system. But I could see in his expression that he was making a mental note, the way people do when something doesn't quite fit their understanding of a situation. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the crimson thread I'd seen tangled in her chair, about the dust patterns on the shelf, about the ash on my own fingertips that I'd hidden from the detectives. I tried to remember how that ash had gotten there, but the memory felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I'd touched something that morning, something that had left that residue on my skin. But what? I'd used my key to open her door, had called her name, had approached the chair where she sat motionless. I'd checked for a pulse, though it was clear she was beyond help. then I'd stepped back and called for emergency services. But there had been something else, some other action I'd taken in those first few moments before the authorities arrived. The memory hovered just out of reach, like a word on the tip of my tongue that refuses to surface. I got up and walked to the shared wall between our apartments, pressing my ear against the cool plaster. Silence, of course, but somehow it felt different now. Not the peaceful quiet of sleep, but the hollow emptiness of abandonment. I found myself wondering what secrets that space might hold, what evidence of her final hours might still be waiting to be discovered. The crimson thread bothered me most of all. It had been so fine, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. But it hadn't belonged to the chair's upholstery or to any clothing she'd been wearing. It had seemed foreign somehow, out of place in the muted browns and beiges of her living room. Over the next few days, I began to pay attention to details I'd previously overlooked. The way the morning light fell across my own living room, creating shadows that could easily be misinterpreted. The sounds that traveled through the building's old walls, how they could be distorted or amplified depending on where you stood. How easy it would be to mistake one thing for another if you weren't paying careful attention. I started to question my own certainty about what I'd witnessed that morning. Memory, I realized, was less reliable than I'd always assumed. It could be influenced by expectation, by stress, by the simple passage of time. What I remembered as clear and unambiguous might have been colored by my assumptions about what should have happened. The detective with the gray mustache called to follow up on a few details. Routine questions, he assured me, just tying up loose ends for the final report. But one of his questions caught me off guard. "You mentioned hearing a thud through the wall. What time was that exactly?" I told them it was around dawn, but now I couldn't remember being so specific. Had it been dawn, or had that been my assumption based on when I'd eventually discovered her? The more I tried to pin down the exact sequence of events, the more uncertain I became. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I'd been sleeping poorly. It could have been earlier." "Earlier how much? An hour? Several hours?" "I honestly don't know. I'm sorry." There was a pause on the line, the sound of papers rustling. The preliminary findings suggest she'd been dead for some time before you found her, possibly most of the night, so if you heard something at dawn, it probably wasn't related to her death. This should have been reassuring, but instead it left me more unsettled. If the sound I'd heard wasn't connected to her death, what had it been, and why had I been so certain it was related? After the call ended, I sat in my kitchen staring at the shared wall. I tried to reconstruct that morning, to separate what I'd actually experienced from what I'd assumed or inferred. The exercise was more difficult than I'd expected. Memory and interpretation had become so intertwined that I couldn't distinguish between them. I remembered the burnt toast smell, but now I wondered if it had actually been toast. The scent had been acrid, bitter in a way that didn't quite match burned bread, and it had been so strong, filling the entire apartment despite the fact that her kitchen was at the opposite end from where I'd entered. The dust patterns on the shelf began to take on new significance as well. I'd assumed something had been moved hastily, but what if something had been placed there instead? What if the patterns indicated addition rather than removal? The crimson thread haunted my thoughts, such a small detail, but it seemed to carry disproportionate weight. I found myself wondering where it had come from, how it had become tangled in the chair's fabric. Had it been there before that morning, or was it evidence of something that had happened more recently? And then there was the ash on my fingertips, the detail that troubled me most because I still couldn't remember how it had gotten there. I'd hidden it from the detectives instinctively, but I couldn't explain why. What had I been afraid they might conclude? The landlord mentioned that he'd found some unusual items while cleaning out her apartment. Papers that had been partially burned in what appeared to be a metal waste basket. He turned them over to the police, thinking they might be relevant to understanding her state of mind. Most were too damaged to read, but some fragments remained. This news hit me like a physical blow. Burned papers explained the scorch marks on the exterior wall, explained the acrid smell I'd mistaken for burnt toast. But it raised new questions about what she'd been doing in her final hours, what documents she'd felt compelled to destroy. I began to wonder if I'd walked into the aftermath of something more complex than a simple death from natural causes. The scene I described to the police as ordinary and unremarkable might have been the carefully arranged result of deliberate actions. But whose actions, hers, in some final attempt to protect secrets she couldn't bear to leave behind, or someone else's, someone who needed to eliminate evidence before the body was discovered? The thought that I might have unknowingly contaminated a crime scene made my stomach turn. But worse was the growing suspicion that my contamination might not have been unknowing at all. The ash on my fingertips suggested I had touched something, handled something in those first few moments before calling for help. What had I done in that apartment before the authorities arrived, and why couldn't I remember? I tried to reconstruct those minutes with forensic precision, but the harder I focused, the more elusive the memories became. I could recall the emotional impact of finding her, the shock and sadness and sense of responsibility, but the physical details, the specific sequence of actions I'd taken, remained frustratingly vague. Had I moved something, touched the burned papers, tried to clean up evidence of whatever had happened during her final hours? The possibility terrified me because it suggested a level of calculation that I didn't want to acknowledge in myself. The detective called again, this time with questions about the burned documents. Had she ever mentioned destroying papers? Did I know what kind of records she might have kept? Had I noticed any unusual activity in the days before her death? I answered as honestly as I could, but I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. Everything I thought I knew about her, about that morning, about my own actions, had become questionable. The solid ground of certainty had shifted beneath my feet, leaving me grasping for something reliable to hold onto. "Is there anything else you think we should know?" the detective asked before ending the call. I almost mentioned the ash on my fingertips, almost confessed my growing doubts about my own memories. But something held me back, fear, maybe, or self-preservation. Or perhaps the recognition that I didn't actually know what I'd done wrong, only that something felt wrong about all of it. "No," I said, "nothing else." But as I hung up the phone, I realized that my certainty about what had happened that morning had completely evaporated. I no longer knew if I'd been a witness to the aftermath of a death or an unwitting participant in something more complicated. The line between observer and actor had blurred beyond recognition. The silence from the apartment next door continued, but now it seemed less like absence and more like waiting. As if the truth were still there, patient and persistent, ready to emerge when I finally found the courage to remember what I'd really done in those crucial moments before help arrived. I kept my hands in my pockets and told myself that everything had been in place, but I was no longer sure which version of events I was trying to preserve, or why it mattered so much that people believed my account of that morning. The only thing I knew for certain was that nothing looked out of the ordinary. And perhaps that was exactly the problem. Story 10. The sun was at its peak, casting a golden warmth over the neighborhood, yet the air felt unnaturally cool. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree, but something in its whisper seemed off, as if carrying secrets. The familiar sound of someone mowing their lawn drifted through the open window, mixing with the distant hum of chatter. In the quiet living room, a single chair was turned away from the table, its worn cushion slightly indented. The air was saturated with the scent of polish, but beneath it lingered the faint aroma of smoke, an unsettling note in the harmony of the routine. I stood in the doorway watching dust particles dance in the shaft of light that cut across the room. The chair bothered me more than it should have. It was the same chair where she always sat during our afternoon conversations, positioned just so to catch the light from the window. Now it faced the wall, as if someone had been sitting there, watching the shadows instead of the street. The detective had left an hour ago, his questions still echoing in my mind. He'd asked about the chair too, making notes in that small pad he carried. I told him I hadn't moved it, which was true, but I couldn't explain why that felt like a lie. My neighbor had called the police. She'd seen smoke coming from the kitchen window around noon, she said, but when the fire department arrived, there was no fire. Just the lingering smell and a pot on the stove with something burned to the bottom. The kind of burning that happens when someone starts cooking and then simply walks away. I pressed my palm against the window frame, feeling the warmth of the sun-heated wood. The texture was familiar, worn smooth by years of hands like mine resting there. But today it felt different, as if the wood itself held memory of something I couldn't quite grasp. The mowing sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the whisper of leaves and distant voices. I realized I'd been holding my breath. She'd been acting strangely the past few weeks, not in any dramatic way, but in the subtle shifts that only someone who'd known her for years would notice. The way she'd pause mid-sentence, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. How she'd started locking doors that had never been locked before. The new habit of checking the street from behind the curtain, her fingers worrying the fabric. I'd asked her about it once, standing in the same doorway while she sat in that chair. She turned to look at me, and for just a moment her expression was that of a stranger. Then she'd smiled and said she was fine, just tired, but her hands had been shaking as she reached for her coffee cup. The smoke smell was stronger near the kitchen. I followed it, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the hardwood floor. The pot sat in the sink now, filled with soapy water that had turned an unpleasant gray. Someone had tried to clean it, but the bottom remained stained black. On the counter, her purse sat open. This struck me as wrong too, though I couldn't say why. She was meticulous about such things, always closing zippers, always putting things back in their place. Inside, I could see her wallet, keys, and something else that made me pause. A photograph partially hidden beneath a folded piece of paper. In it, she stood next to someone I didn't recognize, both of them smiling at the camera. But the smile on her face wasn't the one I knew. This one seemed forced, her eyes holding something that looked almost like fear. I shouldn't have looked at the paper. I knew this even as I unfolded it, my fingers moving of their own accord. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the words brief but somehow heavy with implication. It mentioned a meeting, a time, and an address I didn't recognize. At the bottom, a single initial that meant nothing to me. The detective had asked about her routine, her friends, anyone who might have been bothering her. I'd given him the answers I thought were true, but now I wondered what I'd missed. What conversations had I not really heard? What changes had I dismissed as unimportant? A door creaked somewhere in the house, and I felt my pulse quicken. The sound came again, rhythmic, as if moved by the breeze from an open window, but I'd closed all the windows when the police left. I was certain of it. I followed the sound down the hallway, past family photos that seemed to watch my progress. In one of them, she was laughing at something beyond the camera's view, her head thrown back in genuine joy. When had I last seen her laugh like that? The memory felt distant, obscured by the weight of recent weeks. The creaking came from the bedroom at the end of the hall. The door stood slightly ajar, moving gently back and forth. I pushed it open and found the window wide, the curtains billowing inward with each gust of wind. I was certain I'd closed this window, absolutely certain. But doubt is a peculiar thing. It creeps in through the smallest cracks, making you question what you thought you knew. Had I really closed it, or was that just what I wanted to believe? On the dresser, her jewelry box sat open, its contents undisturbed but somehow wrong. The detective had asked if anything was missing, and I'd said no. But looking now, I realized I didn't actually know what should be there. How well do we really know the private spaces of the people closest to us? I closed the window, testing the lock twice to make sure it held. The silence that followed felt oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of voices from the street. I strained to listen, wondering if one of them might be hers, if she might simply walk through the front door with some reasonable explanation for everything. But the voices faded, and I was left alone with the growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted in the world, something that couldn't be explained by unlocked windows or misplaced chairs. In the kitchen, I found myself staring at the telephone. The detective had given me his card, told me to call if I remembered anything else. But what would I tell him? That the house felt different, that the air itself seemed to hold secrets, that I was beginning to question my own memory of the morning. The notepad beside the phone caught my attention. Her handwriting filled the top page, but the words seemed strange, disconnected. Grocery lists mixed with phone numbers I didn't recognize. In the margin, she'd drawn the same symbol repeatedly, a simple shape that meant nothing to me but had apparently occupied her thoughts. I tore off the page, folding it carefully and placing it in my pocket. The detective probably should see it, but something made me hesitate. Perhaps it was the growing realization that I'd been living alongside a stranger, that the person I thought I knew had been keeping secrets I couldn't begin to fathom. The afternoon light was beginning to shift, casting different shadows across the room. Soon it would be evening and then night, and I would be alone in this house that no longer felt familiar. The thought filled me with a dread I couldn't name. I walked back to the living room, to that turned chair with its indented cushion. Standing behind it, I could see what someone sitting there would have been looking at. Not the wall, as I'd first thought, but the window that faced the street. From this angle, they would have had a perfect view of anyone approaching the house. Had she been watching for someone, or watching out for them? The question hung in the air like smoke, acrid and persistent. Outside, the sun continued its descent, and the normal sounds of the neighborhood carried on, oblivious to the mystery that had settled over this house like a shroud. I knew I should call the detective, should tell him about the photograph and the note, about the window I was certain I'd closed. But something held me back, a growing suspicion that the truth might be more complex than I was prepared to face. As darkness began to gather in the corners of the room, I found myself wondering if I really wanted to know what had happened. Some questions once asked change everything. Some doors once opened can never be closed again. The chair remained turned toward the window, keeping its silent vigil. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the evening breeze, I thought I heard the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk, measured and deliberate, as if someone was finally coming home. But the footsteps passed by, fading into the night, leaving only questions and the lingering scent of smoke that no amount of polish could quite mask.